Okay, so now we're going to be moving on to Lab 9. And this is where it's going to get fun. You guys have, up until this point, learned how to write queries, and you have also learned how to write subqueries, and you have now learned about data types. So, with the data types, the next thing in the next progression is learning how to use those in functions. So, chapter 9 is about functions. And as you know, there's a lot of different types of functions out there. Um, if you start looking at some of the functions covered in this chapter, I'm sure some of you that have used Excel may be able to relate these to some of the things that you've probably used in Excel, like the concat function or the trimming functions where you need to trim something out, or maybe you're focusing on the length or a replace. So I bet some of you are probably already versed with these and pre-wired for them just using some other tools. Like I said, Excel is a good one just because I know that they also use some of these string functions as well. So we'll go ahead and start diving into string functions first. Probably one of the most common and useful that you will use is when you need to string data together, like the concat function. An example of that is if maybe you needed a field and you didn't need two separate fields for a first and last name of a person. So you concatenated the first string and the second string. So you would use those different fields and concatenate them together. Um, sometimes may have you may have a need for trimming out some data. Maybe there are a bunch of trailing zeros that are not necessary for a report. And so you would want to trim out all of that extra data that's really not needed for what someone is needing. Or perhaps maybe you need to start looking in the middle of a string for a very small pertinent piece of information that might be useful because you're going to be using that for something. So there's quite a few different functions in the string categories that you can use. There's a very useful chart in your book on page 259 that you'll want to reference. And so make sure you review all of those. There are more string examples on page 261. And they give you some simple examples on if you are trying to concatenate things, if you're trying to trim, or if you are trying to look for things of a certain length. They also give you tips on how to search for those. So make sure you're reviewing those as well. Okay, so now let's talk about substrings and how to parse those. There's a few different ways and a few different keywords you can use, but it's important to know that when you do it, that those will always go in your select statement. So they will go in and you will have to declare explicitly what you're going to be using. There's also different scenarios on why you would use different ones. If you're trying to break something out, and maybe you do need it separated out into multiple fields, or you're just trying to locate something. So, you can use a substring index, which can be useful. It does vary a little bit from just using the substring just to parse out something. Either one are okay. You'll just need to use your proper syntax in order how to identify the field name. You'll want to make sure that you've inserted all your commas, and then you're also going to want to make sure that you have them properly aliased at the end so your new columns will also render what you expect them to. When you are locating, sometimes you're looking for data within a substring, and so you're having to try to identify that as well. That can be a little tricky, but that's why you use something like the locate function also to help parse that character out within the string. So with that, you would use a locate function, and then you would also integrate your field name and then what you're looking for. And then you would also properly alias that. Remember, as you're creating new derived columns, as you're parsing out your data, it's important to remember that you also alias these properly. Otherwise, your rendering won't separate everything into the columns that you're expecting. So that's make sure that's one pitfall you don't fall into. All right, so when you're also working with numeric functions, a little different than the strings, but this should follow very closely with the data types that we just went over in chapter 8. There are some functions that you will find very useful. The ones that I've worked with the most out in the working world have been definitely rounding and truncating. Truncating has been very, very helpful to me in a former life. The other ones are useful, floor and ceiling, those are also good. You may not always be working with mathematical data where you need to do square roots, but those are also useful just to know and have in your back pocket. And if you ever need to use those to reference them, you've got them. So with that, I would say that, rounding is probably one of the most useful just because in the event that you ingest data and they have lots of decimal points, like we talked about, where it was floating and now it's come into your environment, and maybe you don't need everything that's past a certain numeric value. You just need it to round up to something. Rounding is definitely helpful. So make sure that you're familiar with rounding and also truncating. Truncating is kind of the opposite, where you may get too much data and you just need it to a certain point because past that it's not useful to you. So rounding and truncating, I would say, definitely are the top two that you would want to focus on. If you're also in the business of looking for certain things with floating point numbers, you'll want to also use that function as well. On page 269, I always try to give you page references so you're able to follow along in the book as well. I know the book's not going to give you every scenario possible, but these are helpful. And so just kind of following along is helpful. You may be looking for an exact value that doesn't include something. So you're trying to include approximate values. So when you're using floats, those are also really helpful. Or you may be looking things through a range because you're not sure, and maybe you're trying to find something that you may have fuzzy guidelines on. So just trying to find a range of values can also be very helpful. So look into those. Well, you already have been using in some of your past labs some of the date functions. I know that you all have been using the now function and the sysdate. And so this is just digging into those a little bit more and giving you more options. You have other options for the current date. If you weren't sure what you were looking for, you could always return current date. There's also different time zones that you can use. So we're getting into those a little bit more with the date functions, but those are luckily already things that you're familiar with. When you start working on reporting and writing queries, you also may find that you don't need all of the date material in a field. Sometimes dates will come with timestamps on them in addition to the dates. Maybe you're just really trying to look for certain months. And so you have a variety of different things you can do where you are parsing out just the year. Maybe you're creating a dashboard or a report for someone that's asking you all the data for the year 2021. Well, you don't need every other piece of data, so you're looking specifically for that year, or you're specifically looking for a certain month. Maybe you've got a report to build for someone or a query to send to someone that needs last month's data. You don't need to pour through the whole year. So parsing out just those types of things are very helpful. They help narrow your data down quite a bit. And these functions are pre-built, so you're not having to code and build them. You're kind of letting the predetermined or pre-built functions do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So I definitely think utilizing these have been, in my former life, very useful. especially when I was, like I said, building lots of reports or also creating other functions, because some of the automation is already built in and doing it for you. So those are extremely helpful. Using the date time functions can be very helpful. Learning how to use the date format or the time format can come in real handy, especially when you are looking for data with specific timestamps. Maybe you're looking for data with a certain time frame, or maybe you are just needing to parse out things for very specific purposes. Knowing those two functions are key. You have multiple ways of actually formatting your data with date and time. You can use date, you can use time, and you can also use date time. So those would be good to learn. Also, focus on date diff when you're trying to perform calculated function with dates. I've been asked that before. Can you help us find these types of things in our system? And so, learning how to use dates, because you can't subtract this date from that date, right? Like, not in a mathematic way, but you can if you're using a date diff function. So those are always really useful to use. I would highly suggest review those. On page 279 is a table that will help you kind of look at a few of those examples. Like I said, when I was out in the working world doing a lot of coding and reporting, that's exactly what I would use. I used probably the date add and the date diff the most. If you go on other websites like Stack Overflow or GitHub, a lot of people have a lot of those types of questions out in the forums. How do I get differentials in my date? Because you can't just subtract this date from that date. It's not a simple mathematic, numeric, integer equation. So review those. Those are very crucial. Okay, so let's talk about case statements. I can't tell you how many times I have used these when creating reports and pulling together queries to have data that perhaps on the back end wasn't useful to the end user, and I needed to spell things out in plain language. So, looking at page 285, I've noticed the way that they're kind of displaying these is a little wonky. I would say look at the second example down where it says a select statement that uses a simple case function. Because sometimes it's hard to tell from the book where they're wanting you to nest your your new knowledge. And looking at that, it's very accurate. It will be in your select statement. And so in your select statement, you're going to want to go ahead and create your select. You'll want to have your other fields and then start your case statement. The layout that they did in the book actually looks really good. It's very clean, it's very usable, easy to read. You'll start your case, you'll use the field, and then you'll start your conditions. When this, then this. And your then can be anything. It could be a little literal string you type, it could be characters, it could be a phrase, and then you drop down and you continue on with all your conditions. And then at the end, you're going to end as. And when you end as, you are aliasing the column. And that will be the column name that will be showing up in your results in your query. These things are worth their weight in gold. And I have been a big fan of using them. I've used them with lookup tables before. I've used them with data that on the backside made sense to us coders, but on the end user side, they wouldn't have known what we were talking about had we not spelled it out in plain language in the then. The when is the technical side, the then is the rendering inside your data column. But these are great to use. They are helpful. Like I said, defer to the second one down or the one that is fourth one down. Those are actually how you would code them. They go in your select statement, but that's where they go in your select statement. Sometimes it's a little confusing because they just give you a snippet, but just know that the second and fourth example will show you in your select where they would go. They would go after your field names inside your select and before your from clause. Another thing that I want to touch on is your if functions, as in your if it's null and coalesce. Sometimes you will be searching for data and it's difficult to know if something's null or not null. And so if you are using your if null function, it's essentially helping you find something that's not there, right? It's a null field. You may have lots of columns in your data set, and in some of these rows and some of these columns, maybe there are null values. Sometimes, people don't always practice good database practices, and some things may sneak through the cracks where data should appear there, but somehow things get forced or manually inputted, and there's not guardrails around the checks and balances. So you may end up with some null data. It's happened to me more than once. Um, However, you can search if it is null. And so that's always something to look for. Again, that goes in your select statement as well. Or if you are looking for the coalesce function, sometimes if you are searching in your data, you may be looking for something, the first sign of where something does start if it is not null. And so that's why you're going to want to use kind of those functions to start looking for data that is or is not null. So one of the last things that we're going to touch on is the Reg Ex. As you guys saw in chapter 3, you started to touch base on Reg Ex and regular expression functions. And so those are coming back also. I do believe this is going to be one of the questions in your lab that we will also review. But you will be reviewing the regex expressions. These are going to help you when you are starting to look for your needles in a haystack, and when you are going to be looking for things like pattern indexes and expressions that will help you find data within the fields or within very, very large data sets. Maybe you don't have all the exact specifics. I actually used something very similar to this one time in a role I had when I was a database programmer. I was looking, we had a group of developers offshore, and they had updated some code and unfortunately unmasked some credit card numbers in our system. And so we were not quite sure how far that went back and when it had happened. And so we had to run patterns and indexes just like you would in regex. And we had to start looking for patterns for, MasterCards and Visas versus American Expresses, because those are different links and numbers, and try to go find those different needles in a haystack in very, very large tables with millions of records. So using these special characters and links can be extremely useful to help you find data that you may have a good idea of how to go search for it, but maybe you only have some of the qualifiers of the data. So using these regex expressions and functions can absolutely help you start looking for things in patterns in a more meaningful way. So the last thing that we're going to cover is the ranking functions. And if you've already completed your labs 6 and 7, you will remember from chapter 6 and lab 6, the ranking functions and aggregating with the window functions. So when you're looking at these, just remind yourself that you're already versed with your over and your partition by functions that you've been working with, and you also have a good understanding of sorting and your order by functions. So with that, make sure when you are looking at this, because this will come up in your lab, and I'm creating another video just to be able to review what's going to be in your labs. But when you're creating your queries, good examples in your book, because I know sometimes if you're a visual learner, just seeing how things are laid out are extremely helpful. Remember, that these things are going to be in your select statements. When you're figuring out where all this goes in a query, sometimes it gets a little confusing because, like I said, sometimes the book will give you a snippet and it doesn't exactly show you where it needs to go. But just remind yourself, especially from creating what you did in the previous chapter and the last homework assignments you had, this is going to go in your select. So just remind yourself that when you're working on your ranking functions, because that is going to come up at the end of chapter 9 in one of the last questions that you have. So I'll be reviewing that in the lab section over. But at least this way you can kind of get your eyes on this and you can build on what you know already with your rank functions. If you look at page 293, those have some good examples about where those fit in. I was just making sure that we got those. Yep. And so go ahead and review those. And I will see you in the next video and we will start reviewing your labs.